last week you told me that you have over 700 audiobooks in your Audible account. What does that say about you, Rob? And also, how many of those books have you actually listened to?
It's a little embarrassing. It says that I'm a learnaholic, maybe a bookaholic. I have listened. What's interesting is I bet there's about 150 to 200 kids books, and then my wife probably has about 100. So I have a portion of that number. But I have listened. If they're in my account and I bought them, I have listened to them. So
Wow.
I keep them on a wish list. And then when I am ready to add it into my, list of 3 or 4 books, then I buy it. And here's what I did discover too, little secret right off the bat, is you can return Audible books. And I only do that when I'll get 10, 25% in, and I'm like, this is not good. And you go in and you exchange it. And so if you paid a credit, you get a credit back. If you paid cash, you get the cash back. So I've been doing that ruthlessly now for about 1.5 to 2 years. Because there are probably some in there that, from 5 years ago before I knew this, that I got halfway through and bailed on, but I didn't get the refund for. And I mean, again, Audible's never had an issue because I have 700 books that I've kept, So it says that I like to learn, man. And that's like a huge part, I think, of being a successful founder. There's got to be a little bit of ambition. There's got to be a little bit of willingness to take some risks, but I also think you need to learn stuff really fast.
Yeah, that book returning philosophy, I think, is the tip is pretty good, because I also I start a lot of books and don't finish them. I drop them, and sometimes they're not even bad. They're like, I've gotten enough out of this book, and I can tell it's not going to say that much more, and then I just drop it and move on to something else. But I haven't yet figured out that you could return the book and get a refund, so I'm going to start doing that.
And I only do that with books that I don't. If I listen halfway and I'm like, man, I got some great stuff out of this, but I'm not going to finish it, I don't return it. Just my personal thing is like, because I feel like the author should get the royalties because I got some value out of it, but it's only if I didn't.
Patrick Collison's website has a link to this passage from a book by Umberto Eco. He's this Italian philosopher and novelist, and he had like a couple apartments with just huge libraries, and people would walk in and always ask him, have you read all these books? It's kind of the same question I asked you about your audiobook library. And he liked to troll people and talk about how he hadn't read any of them. Otherwise, why would he keep them there? But I think what's cool about it is he had this idea that essentially your library can also serve as a reminder for all the stuff that you don't know. Yeah. And I thought that was really inspiring. I heard that, and I immediately bought a bunch of books that like all my friends had recommended. I've got maybe like 100 sitting on my shelf, and I've read less than half of them. And it's very humbling because every book I look, I can be like, oh, that's a book my buddy Dave recommended. And I know there's a bunch of stuff that Dave knows that I don't know because he read that book and I haven't, which is great. But also it hasn't really motivated me to read any more than I already have. I'm still like a book or two a month. So it's good for humility, but not necessarily for motivation to read more.
Right. I got to be honest, man. We're obviously in quarantine right now, and the thing I miss most about it is going to bookstores. And I don't actually buy that many physical books, but for the exact same reason you just said, I love being around books.
Yeah,
because I love the knowledge and the idea that there's all this knowledge out there, and I have since I was a kid. My mom used to, when I was 10 years old, we'd go to the mall, and I'd go into like Walden Books, which is totally out of business now, or B. Dalton Booksellers, and she could leave me for 2 or 3 hours. And while that sounds irresponsible in today's parenting environment, I would just sit and read, and then I'd have a big stack, and like, how many can we buy? So totally get it.
Yeah, books are kind of the ultimate ambient decoration to just kind of have around. Yeah. Is there any book you've read in the last year or two that you just can't stop thinking about, you can't shut up about, you're telling everybody about some idea that you learned from that book?
There's a book that impacted me a lot, and I've referred it to a few people, but it's called, it was actually referred to me by Stephen Kellett, who's a microconf attendee. It's called Why We Sleep. And it's just the science of sleep. And it talks about how sleeping in a room that is not really dark, relatively cold, and really quiet is, even though you kind of don't notice it in your physiology, it's not ideal from an evolutionary perspective. And that there's basically an epidemic of people who don't get enough sleep, people who, like teenagers, all the angst that comes with that is, scientists are starting to think it's that, wow, when you're 15 and going through puberty, you need 10, 12 hours of sleep a night, whereas high school students get, much less than that. And it's just, sleep is like, I often say, like, pricing is the biggest lever in a SaaS business, or really in most businesses. Sleep, I think, is perhaps one of the biggest levers in our lives. Sleep and exercise, probably. So Why We Sleep, super, super fascinating.
One of the books I have on my shelf as well. Completely agree. I'm one of these like very insensitive. Like I'm not very sensitive to my body. I'll go without sleep and be like, I feel perfectly fine. But then there's certain things where I can tell, like, oh, this lack of sleep is affecting me. Like when I'm coding, for example, and I find myself really just wanting to like take a bunch of shortcuts and just get things done as quickly as possible and not like write the right code. And I'm like, oh, it's because I'm tired. Or if I'm playing poker or something and just like not really thinking about every hand, I can tell like a really subtle difference in how I'm playing if I'm like not caught up on sleep or not. And so I think all the tips in that book are super great. And any founder who wants to operate at kind of, the peak level should probably be getting a lot more sleep, doing a lot more exercise than they think, even though it seems probably, on its face more immediately productive to just stay up an extra hour and get like answer those emails, etc.
Yeah. For most of my adult life until I don't know when I discovered this. This is within the last 10 years. I discovered the same thing, my sensitivity to sleep and how it impacts me. And for me, it's not just productivity. It is literally my outlook. It's like my opinions on matters would change. I'd wake up and I'd almost feel depressed or very pessimistic to the point of I'm running drip, and I would get up and just be like, this business, I mean, we're doing whatever, we're doing 7 figures in ARR. And I'd be like, this business isn't going to work. Like there are too many competitors and we're just going to get crushed. And I would have this feeling of impending doom. I wouldn't tell anyone, but I would feel this crushing weight all day. Yeah. And then I would get a good night's sleep and wake up and be like, what was I thinking? Like it literally would change my psychology. So I started tying it to sleep, and it was 3 things for me. It was sleep, lack of exercise, and like drinking alcohol the night before, which would it really degrades your sleep quality. Yeah. And so as I tweaked those things, I really don't have many days. It's very rare that I have a day like that now.
It's funny. You hear like all this basic advice that we've probably been hearing since we were kids, sleep and exercise. And like for startups, it's kind of the same thing. Like talk to your customers, make something, charge more. And it's one thing to hear that stuff and be like, okay, I get it. But it's another thing to actually do it. And there's like a very long list of things that like I get and I'm tired of hearing, but that I don't actually do. And I think, a lot of it is just the fundamentals. If you're playing basketball, you're on a sports team, the coaches are just like, do the fundamentals. That'll get you 90% of the way there. And most people just don't do the fundamentals. They're focused on like all these like fancy tricks and extra stuff, and they're not really doing the basics.
Right. I'm going to buy the next book and implement the next productivity thing and the next growth hack and the next body hack. Cause I'm going to take the newest thing, protein that I pour in my coffee with this la la la. And it's like, but are you doing the basics? Cause the basics are boring. The basics tend to be hard work, or at least require discipline. And I think this is a perfect analogy for starting a startup or just living life and being healthy. It's like, we want to read about the next growth hack, Yeah. But really, it's about, we know it. What is it, Cortland? It's talk to your customers. It's find the basic stuff. It's all of it, and it really it is interesting.
So you're trying to do something that I don't know if there is a list of basics out there that I don't know if it's something that's really been done before. You're trying to basically take the Y Combinator accelerator model and apply it to bootstrappers. And you talked about this a bit on the podcast a year ago when you first launched TinySeed. Remind us all about the concept and how it works.
Yeah, so TinySeed is it was the first startup accelerator designed for bootstrappers. We've really focused on SaaS. So I tend to say now it's like the first startup accelerator designed for SaaS bootstrappers. In essence, we saw, I say we, it's Einar Volstead is my co-founder and just through, my podcast and the conference MicroConf and all the stuff I do online and just conversations with founders. I've done advising. I've done a little bit of angel investing on my own. I did about 12 or 13 angel investments privately. So I have a lot of insight I have a lot of conversations, and then I have exposure to quite a few founders and companies and all that. And I kept seeing this bifurcation where it was like, all right, you can raise venture capital, which really most of us don't want to do because it comes with a bunch of strings attached, and not always, it's getting better, but really, I don't want to move to Silicon Valley. I don't want to work 90-hour weeks, et cetera, all the tropes there. And then there were folks that were self-funding or bootstrapping, and which is what I've done. But it's hard. It's hard. I mean, this, that like bootstrapping a company is hard. And so I remember at an early stage of Drip, I was like, man, if I had literally like a couple $100,000, my life would be, not in my personal account, but in the business account, my life would be noticeably different. And I started seeing companies do this. So like Customer.io raised a couple $100,000 back in 2012. And then Jordan Gall with Cart Hook raised money. I invested in them. And this isn't they're not raising it to go on the venture track. They're raising it to, in essence, get to profitability, to reach escape velocity, to get product market fit, to start marketing, and then to become profitable at some point. And they can raise venture later if they want, or they could sell the company, or they could just take dividends out. And it's this whole different model. And so I started seeing a lot of founders interested in that. I started kind of talking about it, thinking about, who's doing this, where's the money coming from? And I kept eventually I kind of was over diversified with startups. I had too much money in angel investments. And so people were asking, like, who's investing like this, and where can I find investors that aren't trying to shoot for unicorns? They aren't only funding the Ubers and the Instacarts, but they'll fund just a SaaS idea that can do 5 million a year. And so that was the original idea. As I got together with Einar and we raised about just under $4.5 million as a fund, but we didn't just want to write checks. I mean, my whole adult life since I started, blogging in 2005 has been trying to educate, but just trying to help founders. Because if I'm a year ahead of you, like, I feel like I can offer some advice at least on what you're doing. And so that's it. So it's a year-long remote accelerator. And we decided to do a year-long because SaaS takes a really long time. And we felt like the 90-day dash to a demo day is helpful, but we think there's more value in a longer program. And then we wanted to do a batch because, man, just the network and the motivation of working together with other founders is huge. And it's remote because really where else could you pull together that many bootstrappers? Because we are so distributed. We're in hundreds of cities across the world. So
yeah,
that's the long and short of it. And we just launched this second batch.
I saw it. It's a lot of great companies. I am a mentor and TinySeed, and you've got kind of an all-star list of mentors as well. Heaton Shaw, Jason, and DHH from Basecamp, Rand Fishkin, Patio 11, your wife Sherry Walling, and Laura Roeder, April Dunn. It's like a who's who of Indie Hackers podcast guests, basically helping out these startups. Let's talk about this cohort model, which I think is fascinating. So I went through Y Combinator in 2011, and the way any accelerator works is everybody joins at the same time. The latest batch of TinySeed, all these companies join at the same time, and they kind of go through this process of building their companies while talking to other people. I think that's kind of the secret to why Y Combinator is so successful and why a lot of the companies are so successful. It's kind of an X factor that companies going through YC have that companies who are just sort of on their own don't have. A bunch of peers who are working alongside them. What is your take on the cohort model, and how's it working for TinySeed?
Yeah, it was something. So Einar went through YC back in 2009, and he knew the value of the same, experiencing it like you knew the value. And then for me, having started a couple different online communities and then MicroConf, and seeing the value of getting people together and realizing that there's so much more value in, the hallway track, the conversations in the hallway versus watching a speaker speak. It was kind of a no-brainer from the start. And in our very first really crappy hack together landing page for TinySeed that I put up overnight, we had kind of some basic tenets. Like, it was a little bit manifesto-ish, right? This is what we believe. We believe it should be remote. We believe we should not shoot after unicorns, and we believe in the batch model, the cohort model. The support between batch members, the willingness to help, the shared expertise of, hey, 2 batch members are amazing in enterprise sales, and 3 of these folks really know SEO well. It's just this. It's amazing. And then even to be able to friendly competition against one another of like, hey, they're doing pretty well. We're not in the same vertical. Maybe we can borrow a trick, like what's working for you right now,
Yeah.
as well as the network. It's like just everyone has their own network, and we're able to tap into that. So I have no desire to not do that. I mean, I think that is I've actually seen there is a fund that did batch models and then didn't, and then went back to doing batch models because of how much value they saw in it.
Yeah, there's just so much motivation in having other people working on their things at the same time as you. And I feel like, I talk to a lot of founders who just have trouble with motivation. They wake up every day and like they're living in some city where there's not that many other indie hackers. They don't have a lot of friends who are doing this, and it's just them. And, maybe they're not getting a lot of sleep. So they wake up and they have like this existential crisis, like, oh man, is my company going to work? Is this stupid, et cetera? But when you have other people motivating you and doing the same thing, if you have some of this friendly competition, you have some of the support, it sounds like, a little airy fairy, just like, oh, everyone work together. But like the reality is we're such social creatures, we're so programmed inherently to care like what other people think, to care about status, to care about not letting down our colleagues, to care about impressing people, and all these like sort of like emotional levers that pull us along. I think it's incredibly powerful just to have a ton of people you're working with.
Yeah. And people who genuinely care about your success, because you're like you're like a college class or a sorority or fraternity where you really are, you have a pretty deep connection to one another. And especially, we do 3 in-person retreats during the year, just to get everybody together, because in-person really, it does trump Zoom and video chat. And man, those bonds start to go pretty deep. Friendships form, that aren't just talking about work. And yeah, it's pretty special.
So let's talk about how this works. I had Tyler Tringus on the podcast last year. He runs Earnest Capital, which has kind of a similar goal, funding for bootstrappers. And he said, quote, you can't just take the YC model and copy it over to bootstrappers. And of course, what he meant by that was you can't just copy and paste. You have to adapt it to account for the differences between bootstrappers who you're investing in and what makes them different than like the kind of high growth startup trajectory that YC companies take. And there's a huge question mark, obviously, around whether or not this model can actually work. So TinySeed is a year in. Is it working?
I mean, I would say, yeah. There's, the companies are growing. The feedback we're getting is overwhelmingly positive in terms of kind of like we're talking about. Like people said, man, I almost didn't realize the value of being in a batch. The quality of the companies we get, who apply is high. There's obviously a lot of demand on the company side. Between the first 2 application periods, we got, I believe it's almost 1,600 applicants.
Wow.
For batch 1 and 2 combined. Yeah, it's a lot. And the quality of them, meaning the traction or just the experience level, is high. So we are obviously tweaking things as we go along. Like the first batch, the whole year was going to be kind of the same, where it's like, oh, we'll do mentor calls. We'll definitely, interact a lot with the batch members, and we will do a lot of kind of mastermind calls where the batch is talking to each other. But we realized there was some education that was needed early on, and then there was like less of that needed as you went along. So we're tweaking things to where the kind of the curriculum or the week to week how it looks is different in batch 2. But it's, at this point, it's really tweaks. It's things that we're just kind of mixing it up.
How does kind of your funding model work as an investor? I want to talk about like the business of being an investor. For example, how do you get paid as the sort of partner of TinySeed?
It's so funny. Every time you say as an investor, I'm like, wait, who?
Like who are you talking about?
I still identify as a founder. That's like who, and I'm not just saying, like, I've been doing this work without writing checks in companies for 15 years, because it's something I enjoy it so much, being around ambitious people trying to do interesting things and make and create companies. And again, I was doing it and not writing checks. And that's why I started a conference. And that's why I've been blogging and podcasting about this topic, because it's just so interesting to me. So while I do, obviously, technically, I am an investor. I write checks into companies. I don't identify as that. I really do identify it as someone. I almost look at the money to be able to write a check to a founder is an excuse to be able to help them over an extended period of time and to justify that. Like I have to justify it to myself. I can't do that for free, right? It really is a side effect of all the other stuff, all the mentorship and the teaching and the helping and the trying to do it. I wouldn't say, oh, right. So that was a preamble, but you were saying, how do we get paid? Like, do you mean me personally?
Yeah, you personally. Because I think, there's like VC firms, there's private equity firms, there's hedge funds. And from what I understand, there's like kind of this 2+20 model that's very common. Does that work with TinySeed? Is that what you're using? And I think it's just an interesting model for people to learn about, because a lot of people don't know. Cool. So how does it work at TinySeed?
Yeah, it is based on a 2 and 20 model. But I'll give you an example. So like we raised our first fund. Normally a venture capital firm would raise a fund and then they deploy it over, I think it's 3 to 5 years. And then it plays out over another 5 to X amount of years. Mm-hmm. We deployed our entire fund in 2 years. and we run an accelerator program. So we have a full-time, program manager. We have
Right.
in-person retreats. We have like way more expenses than if we were just writing checks, we would have almost no expenses. Like I take literally a stipend. Like, so it is not buckets of money coming out to me. So we front load that the 2%. Typically, the 2 and 20 model is if you raise a fund, you take 2% of the fund value per year as management fees. So imagine if you raise $1 million fund, then 2% for 10 years, you're going to take out 20 grand a year for 10 years, totally 200,000. And then the 20% is called carry. And it really is just you get after the fund is paid back. So after $1 million would be paid back in that case, then the fund that you get 20% of the profit of any gains that you make.
Yeah.
2 and 20. We have to front load that too. We can't do 2% a year. Again, our fund was $450,000 and 2% of that would have been 90 grand. And that would not be enough to keep the lights on, given that we're running this, we meet multiple times a week with founders for 52 weeks. So it's not something we can just write and kind of be advisors. So we front load some of that. And we essentially effectively run it at break even, which is what most venture funds do. And most venture funds don't make any money unless they carry that profit, unless they make a profit. And that's the return to investors.
Yeah, I know a lot of people in SF where it's become trendy for a lot of these like higher growth tech startups, founders to like raise a fund after their company exits. And there's all sorts of smaller funds, but because of that model, a lot of people just raise huge funds because they're going to get that 2% management fee. They'll try to raise like $100 million from whoever they can. And that means they can justify paying themselves $2 million a year. But then unlike TinySeed, they don't necessarily have a lot of expenses. So that just like goes in their pockets for being an investor. And I think in a lot of ways, it misaligns their incentives. Because they can make more money from the 20% carry if they actually make good investments, but they're still rich just from the fees. And so they don't actually have to return, have good returns for their investors.
I would agree with you there. That's it would feel weird to me to take personal money out of the management fee. That to me, that's not what it's for. It's for running the business. I don't know. I am new to this though, right? I wrote my first angel check maybe 10 years ago, but really this type of stuff, I'm about 2 years in, and I've seen some weird stuff like that doesn't make a ton of sense.
What would you say, given your sort of new perspective, that your average bootstrapper doesn't understand about fundraising? What are some common misconceptions?
I mean, I think there's some bootstrappers can have kind of the black and white mindset of like, well, all funding is bad. And it's like, well, there may be some there are, of course, these horror stories of raising venture capital and having strings attached and having, I can't sell my company because it was blocked. I was fired from my own company because the board fired me. There's all these things, liquidity preferences. If I sell, they get paid back 2x before I get any. And those things do happen and have happened. I think it's less so these days. But then there's this whole other thread of, to say all funding is bad. It's like TinySeed is, I just wouldn't call it venture capital. It's much more growth capital for early stage SaaS companies. And you have to know who are your investors, because all investors are not alike. If you go to Sand Hill Road in the Bay Area, there are venture capitalists and they want $1 billion companies or $10 billion companies. Whereas TinySeed is me and Einar, and we just have a different view on it. And we believe that a 7-figure, 8-figure SaaS company it's a huge win for the founders. Life-changing amounts of money can come out of that. And if we can help more founders get there, like that's the goal. And again, we have to justify it. I can't personally do it for free. And so the model that we've set up, I think people wouldn't have dreamed of it 10 years. Like if you went to a venture capitalist and said, can you make money investing in companies that won't be unicorns? Most of them will tell you no, because the kind of the common wisdom in the VC space is you make money on your Airbnbs and your Ubers, and you lose money on most of the other ones. But the way we've modeled it out, that's not, it doesn't appear to be the case.
So explain your model to me. Like, how do you make it so that this model works? Does it have to be the case that like everyone you invest in succeeds? How do you actually try to profit if you're not, expecting these companies to become, $1 billion unicorns?
Yeah. There's two things really. One is fewer companies will fail. These are just more like, when you go for a base hit, meaning let's say a 7 or 8 figure SaaS app, so many more make it there than implode, because when you pour an inordinate amount of money, let's say you put 10, 20, $30 million into a company and you say, all right, become a $1 billion company, it instantly, your risk shoots through the roof that you're going to fail, because you hire 50, 100 people. There's way more chaos. You're moving way faster. And it just makes it more likely that you are going to fail. I've seen it many times, actually.
Here.
Yeah, I think living in San Francisco, you probably see it all the time, where you're like, hey, that company would have been a great $5 or $10 million business, but they raised funding and then they trucked the company. They destroyed it, And again, I'm not saying all VC does that, but I'm saying it just increases the likelihood. What a big chunk of venture capital, if you raise 10, 20, 30 million, it really increases your likelihood of failing or of being a unicorn, a $1 billion company. It's they want it to be binary, because that's just the way it is. Whereas we say, what if 40, 50, 60% of the companies could be successful and be these nice base hits, and none of them become unicorns. And then the other thing is, as opposed to Y Combinator, they are able to they're able to give slightly higher valuations than we are, because they will have the Dropboxes and the Airbnbs. And so those are kind of the two factors that allow us to exist.
I have probably 5 or 6 conversations a year with founders where they're either super excited that they just raised a ton of money from VCs and they're going down that sort of very polarized path of like unicorn or bust, and they're just super confident they're going to become a unicorn. And then next year I follow up and they're like, I should have just bootstrapped. Because your company can be doing pretty well. It can be like making money and growing, but if it's not growing at this ridiculously crazy rate, with those kind of investors, you're the walking dead. You can't raise another round. No one wants to touch you, but you also owe your investors a bunch of money and you feel like crap, even if your company's doing well. But let's talk about...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
There are so many more companies that can be successful 7 and 8 figure businesses than there can be $1 billion companies. And yeah, they've just been neglected, by this. They've been neglected by kind of people who can give them a little bit of funding to help them get along, with few strings. So that's really been the goal.
So let's talk about how you start one of those companies, because I know we're making it seem a little easy here. Like it's a base hit, it's way easier. It's still hard. And I think there's a lot of things that you've learned as an investor and also as like a very storied founder who spent a lot of time starting pretty successful companies. First of all, do you think your perspective as an investor has changed how you think about starting one of these base hit companies?
I do, because I'm seeing even more, even though I've for 10, 15 years been immersed in the space and thinking about it and talking to founders, I'm now getting more and more deep dive data points. So I have 30, I believe, across TinySeed, and then the angel investments I did before TinySeed, I have 36 companies I've invested in. And for most of them, I am either, if they're in TinySeed, I'm talking to them every week. And if angel investments, I typically get like monthly updates. So I'm seeing financials, I'm seeing how they operate, I'm seeing how different founders approach things. Just a broader insight, I think, than I've had in the past. And so it has made me definitely seeing patterns in company. Example is like, this is from a little bit personal experience, but also from looking across companies. It's like, I don't plan to ever start a SaaS again, but if I did, I would start from the assumption of, I want one with expansion, like expansion revenue is built in and net negative churn is possible. I don't think I would build a business without that, because it's just such an immense growth lever.
So explain that to people who don't know what expansion revenue is or net negative churn, because I agree, it's like immense, but it's not an obvious thing if you're a first time founder that this is a thing you can even think about or plan ahead for.
Yep. And I didn't plan for it. So I started a company called Drip, which was an email service provider and later became marketing automation. And we had expansion revenue and we hit net negative churn, and we did it by accident. So, but once I saw it, I was like, this is incredible. So expansion revenue is basically where, let's say you're a SaaS company and you have 3 or 4 pricing tiers, or you maybe have 50 pricing tiers, but you have a metric, a value metric it's called, which is like in email service providers, it's a number of subscribers, right? Mm-hmm. Or in CRM, it's a number of seats, number of salespeople you're paying for. And that number organically, like over time, it ticks up. It goes up for the majority of your customers, and your revenue expands even when you could literally not add any new customers, and enough customers are expanding. And so you think about email subscribers, most lists, if people are working on them, their goal is to build them, and the more subscribers you get, the more you wind up paying MailChimp or Aweber or Drip. And so that's the expansion piece. Net negative churn is where your churn, not counting, you don't count new customers, but where literally your existing customer base is growing and it's expanding your revenue base. If you literally added 0 new customers, your revenue would increase month to month. And in many of these businesses, like a Zoom or a Slack where it's seat-based, or Salesforce where it's seat-based, or MailChimp, which I believe did bootstrapped to $700 million in ARR. And they did that in 2019. Expansion revenue is a substantial portion of that. And so it's just it's kind of, I like to think of, if recurring pricing, like if SaaS is the golden ticket of building and selling software, I think like net negative churn expansion revenue is like the golden ticket of SaaS. It's like the thing the pinnacle. It's the thing you aspire to do. And it's not possible in every space. Every app can't do it. Every vertical can't do it, but there are some ways to engineer it.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things when you're a first-time founder, you're very focused on acquisition. Like you don't have any customers, you don't have any users. And so you kind of think the only lever that you can pull is, how do I get more users in the door? And like maybe, in the very beginning, that's true. You don't have anyone. There is no expansion revenue to be gained. But as you go on and you get customers, like that becomes huge, because it's easier to sell to people who've already given you their credit card. They're already paying you. They already know you and trust you and like you. And if you don't unlock additional revenue from them, you're just like spending all your time trying to get new people who don't know you. You have to persuade, just way harder. And it feels like an endless grind. What are some of these businesses and some industries where it's easier to get expansion revenue? And how can like a brand new founder who's trying to come up with an idea think about this in advance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I've ever really thought that through as a framework. Certainly anything, the moment you find there's kind of 3 ways to structure pricing, right? One is based on a value metric, which is like subscribers or seats, like I said. Second is to do feature gating. So to gate off features. So it's not based on usage of your product at all. It's based on which features do you need, and you have to pay more for these types of features. And then the third one is to do both, right? So you'll see there's value metric and feature gating going on at the same time. And oh man, yeah. If I were to, sorry, I'm getting texted here. And it's distracting me. So you edit. I know you don't edit the video,
yeah.
but at least
I can edit the video
and out of the audio. Okay. I don't know that it matters that much, but I literally forgot your question.
Yeah.
As these texts pouring in.
I think you're just talking about expansion revenue, how to think of it as a founder. And so you're going over different ways that like you can actually
how to find.
Yeah.
How to find it. And so feature gating doesn't tend to be expansion. It really tends to be, hey, it's based on the value metric as that number goes up. So A, I would focus on that. And then B, it's to think in any space, will this number actually go up over time? And will it go up enough? And it's hard, you just have to guess, right? And one way is to look around and be like, wow, all the CRMs I know charge per seat. I'm guessing that's a pretty good way to do it. So if I have something that I can charge per seat, and of course the rule of thumb is if user A and user B log into your app, they're in the same company, and they see something different, then you should charge per seat. And if they see the same thing, then you shouldn't. But if seats is a great value metric, assuming that these teams grow over time, or that right. Your app will infiltrate the company more over time, because sometimes they only need 3 seats and then it's permanent. You just kind of got to think through it. They're not going to expand. Subscribers, of course, is another one, and all these contacts in like ESPs and those kinds of things. And that's probably a pretty good way to do it, because they do it. But like I had an app that was an SEO keyword tool, right? So it was a SaaS app. You connected it to like your Google Analytics, and it sucked in keywords, and then it recommended keywords that you should attack based on your actual incoming traffic, right? So there was an algorithm it used. And I was like, expansion revenue, because it's based on number of keywords processed or number of visits per month or something like that. But you know what? A lot of websites really they just weren't growing, especially for some reason the people that were coming to me, they weren't busting through the tiers to the next thing. And I thought it might, but really it wasn't as successful as I thought it would be. So, and the other thing to keep in mind is typically it is your larger customers. Your larger customers got there by growing fast, and they're the ones that are going to continue to grow fast in general.
We were talking last week, and you also mentioned another lever besides just expansion revenue, but more broadly pricing, which you said is perhaps the biggest lever that you have as a founder, and also onboarding being quite powerful. Why is pricing the biggest lever that founders have?
I mean, it's just something that most of us get it wrong, and it's really easy to get wrong because pricing is hard, But raising your prices is something that you can literally do in 10 minutes by going to your website and going into Stripe or whatever. And whereas so many other levers, it's like, let's build this big integration, 2 months of work. It's such a fascinating thing. In addition, pricing, typically you find that the more you can increase prices, your growth, now everyone's paying that, it compounds and everyone's, it can really increase growth, but also changes your customer type. If you're charging $25 a month or $250 a month, you'll have a different customer base, assuming you can figure out a way to charge 250. They will tend to be less price sensitive. These are generalizations, but they will tend to churn less. Mm-hmm. And you will tend to then start attracting even larger customers. And the best businesses that I see from the inside are the ones that have kind of low price plans with really wide funnels, really wide reach. In a big market like electronic signatures or I'm just giving examples, or podcasting or something where there's just a lot of people doing it, but that's not their thing. That's not where they make the most of their money. They make the most of their money from enterprises that come in and say, you have a $10 plan. So you have this great brand because you have thousands of customers doing that. But it's when they approach you and they say, we want to have 20,000 documents a month signed. All right, that's $5,000 a month. And you'll see it over and over. You can look at IPO, publicly traded SaaS companies. You can look at, I remember a story, Wufoo.com.
Yeah.
Wufoo, they sold several years ago. And one of the quotes in the press release, he was like, one of the founders was like, 80, maybe 90% of our revenue came from 10% of our customers. The lower price plans were really just, they kind of are feeders up into the enterprise, but they're also just a way for you to have a brand that, feeds up into the higher price. I'm not saying every business needs to be that way, because you can certainly there are other models that work, but the ones that I see growing pretty fast are thinking about it that way. And that's kind of pricing engineering, right?
Yeah.
It's thinking about how can I balance these things.
I think it also goes back to that kind of obsession that new founders have with just bringing new customers in the door. And if you think about how much money you make, well, it's like the price you charge times the number of customers. And if you're solely focused on just growing the number of customers, you're kind of leaving out the entire other half of this equation, which is like, you could make twice as much money by changing, a number on your website. And that is way easier than finding twice as many customers.
Yeah. And we've had, this is something we focus on really early on in the TinySeed, with the TinySeed batches, because I was on a call today actually with batch 2, and I said, raise your hand if you think you're underpriced, or that your value metric is off, or that something's just off with your pricing. And I believe it was 90% of the batch. And we're a week in, right? So that's going to be the first thing we focus on. The first thing we iron out is going to be pricing, because everything else flows from that. Because if you're selling for $50 a month, and you don't have a ton of expansion revenue, it's not 50 per seat, $50 a month, you can't afford to do enterprise sales. It changes your customer, it changes your marketing. You can't afford to do typically cold email outreach if you're charging $50 a month. Probably can't afford Google AdWords. If you're charging $500 a month, changes all the ways you can market, changes the ways you can sell. Everything else really flows from that. I started off, I've been thinking, for a couple months, saying like pricing is perhaps your biggest lever, and now it's like I can't think of a bigger lever than that. It's only 3 ways to make more money in your business. The first is to raise your prices. The second is to find more customers, which you've referred to, which is typically the default everyone thinks of. And then the third is to sell more like add-ons and such to your existing customers. But typically, figuring out how to build a more valuable product, how to position it in a way that it seems more valuable. Because if you position yourself against cheap competitors, everyone's going to compare your prices to them. If you can figure out a way to position and play with the people who are charging $500 a month, and then that's the baseline, it's incredibly powerful. We did this with Drip, right? We were an ESP, and people compared us to MailChimp and Aweber. And one day it hit me, we're kind of a marketing automation platform, which is a lot of people haven't heard that term. They're just expensive, complicated pieces of software. And they started at about $400 or $500 a month and went up, and there were thousands a month. And so suddenly our $49 a month price point was not compared to MailChimp. It was compared to Infusionsoft, Marketo, and Pardot and stuff. And that was something I stumbled on earlier. That's where I was like, positioning is actually another, positioning and onboarding are kind of other, levers in addition to pricing.
Yeah, I was talking to Baird Hall as a company called Wave, and another company called Subtitle. And he kind of had the same positioning thing where his Subtitle company was basically doing this sort of transcription for your podcast videos and would add text. And he just couldn't charge that much for it because everybody was comparing him to rev.com. And it's only like, a dollar a sentence or something. It's so cheap. And then he changed his positioning. So people started comparing him to more like video editing software. And then suddenly you could just charge like 10 times more. And I think, I'm interested in this process you're going through with educating founders going through TinySeed about pricing, because it's something we talk about so often on this show. And yet when I go to Indie Hackers meetups or I'm on the forum and I'm talking to people, they really it just doesn't get through. And I think a lot of founders have this idea that, okay, well, you know what you need to do is start off charging $5 a month. And then eventually after you build enough features and you're well established enough, then eventually you can, raise your prices to 50 or 500, but you can't start there. What's your take on that, Rob? Do you think founders should start by picking an idea where they can charge more, or do you think they need to sort of work their way up from a tiny amount and eventually start charging more?
You can do either, of course. Both, there are examples of both that could work. I would I would lean towards the stair-step approach, which is to build a smaller product in a less competitive niche that probably is lower priced and that will plateau just to learn the ropes, and then take that money, whether you sell that or whether you just take the cash off of it to kind of do your next thing. And that would be more the latter, where you start off with kind of a feature, get live quick. You're probably going to be dealing with, $5 customers are going to be a pain in the butt, but I don't think that that's a terrible way to go, especially if it really is your first time and you just don't know the ropes. However, I know that if you want to build like a substantial business, like let's just say a high 6-figure, 7-figure business, the one with the $5 start is, you're going to be wandering for a long, long time. And when I started, I've started and grown a bunch of companies, and the last one I did before TinySeed was Drip. I wrote down, I want to build a product where the lowest price point is X. And originally X was 99, and by the time we launched, it was 49. But the idea was I didn't want to play that game anymore, because I had cheaper SaaS apps before, and they just came with baggage. They came with a burden, and they were harder to grow, in my experience. And so aspirational pricing is what I call this, where like I aspire to be able to charge $49 a month. So then we started building stuff, and I had an idea and we showed it to customers, and they were like, not really. But instead, and some people started using it, and they said, this just isn't worth $49 a month. And so what I didn't do was lower the price, because some people are saying like, I'd be willing to pay $19 a month for this. And I didn't say, okay, cool, I'm going to lower the price to 19. What I said was, what would we need to build for this to be worth $49? And obviously had dozens and dozens of conversations, and it wasn't clear cut, and there's a bunch of gut feel, and it wasn't like all the customers told me the same thing. We did have to, me and my co-founder had to whittle away and figure out what to build next. And it took us a while to get there, but it's a process you have to go through. This is the hardest. This stage, when you're trying to figure out pricing and your pre-product market fit, I would say is one of the most difficult of starting a startup.
There's almost this bright dividing line that I see when talking to indie hackers, where on one side you have a lot of the founders who are, for example, in TinySeed, and they have a business and they're making it work, and they're talking about all sorts of like SaaS metrics to optimize and hiring, and like it's kind of more just advanced tips and worries that founders have. But they're already making money, and they're just trying to make more money and grow their companies and be more impactful. But on the other side, and this is the vast majority of people, like they're really struggling just to like come up with an idea that makes any sense at all, to get any customers in the door. A lot of people are stuck at like making $100 or $200 a month, and like they're working for months just to try to get it to $300 a month. And, obviously the answer to this will differ from person to person, but, what do you think are some of the biggest differences between people on either side of this line, and how can people sort of, cross that line and try to figure out how to make a business that's actually working?
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. There's a lot there. I mean, I think there's at its basis, there's a bunch of things I could cover, but honestly, like I think of success and being able to achieve it really as these three, like first principles, these three factors, and it's hard work, it's luck, and it's skill. And different success stories have varying degrees of those. So you'll hear a story about a founder who gets incredibly lucky and hit the right place at the right time in their skill set. Like what Steve Wozniak's an example of this, right? He happened to be in this hobby that turned out these personal computers, and he happened to have done hard work for years to learn how to build these circuits, and he had built that skill through the hard work, right? But Apple wouldn't be Apple if they hadn't hit that timing just right. Similar with Bill Gates and Windows with IBM, or I'm sorry, it was MS DOS at the time with IBM. There was a more luck, and I think Zuckerberg. I think a lot of these like deca-billion-dollar companies, there has to be some luck factor, even if that luck is just timing.
Yeah.
So and you can't really control luck, but I do think you can influence luck by working hard, which I don't know of any majors. There's only one or two, probably one I can think of. It's a friend of mine who I won't name, but he basically says, I got really lucky and I didn't actually work that hard. Usually the story is when you hear Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, or when you hear, I'm trying to even think like Heaton Shaw and Jason Cohen and, Rand Fishkin and those types of folks, they all work pretty hard, especially in the early days, and DHH and Jason Fried I know that, they don't work full work weeks now. I think they work 30 to 40 hours a week. But in the early days, my guess is they worked hard. And by hard, I don't mean long hours. I mean focused effectiveness. You're driving, working on the right things, and you're just working and putting in the time. I have tended in my professional life, especially since I've been running my own companies, it's rare I work more than 40 hours a week. But in the early days, I had no money to speak of, and I really didn't have many skills. So I just put in hours, and I would work a day job. When I say no money, I mean I could afford my house payment stuff, but I didn't have a bunch of extra money. When I heard people say friends and family round, I was always like, what we have no money. No one has any money. Like my dad's an electrician, it's like they had money to put food on the table and that's it. So yeah, I would go to work all day, and then I'd come home, I'd eat dinner, and then I would work for 5 to 6 hours. I would check out books from the library. I taught myself how to program. I would eventually started, building apps, and I built those skills over time. And there's a bunch of factors, that we could go down rabbit holes of like, what about money, right? And I would say, well, maybe you're lucky to be born with money, or maybe you need to work hard to earn money, and build skills that are valuable and blah, blah, blah. But those are kind of the three base factors I see, is that most founders I know who are successful are not afraid of the hard work. They have built skills up over time, and eventually they stumble into a little bit of luck, or they kind of make their luck over the course of, a decade of just putting in the time and building the skills.
I was talking to David Shu, who runs a company called Retool, a few weeks ago. Hopefully I can get him on the podcast. But his story it's like the thing that I go to when I think about luck as a founder. So him and his co-founder bootstrapped to something close to $1 million in revenue. Then they did almost the opposite fundraising thing that you've been talking about. Like they bootstrapped there, and then they raised a bunch of money. Now they're going for broke, almost like Jason Cohen is doing with WP Engine. But when I talk about like how he found his idea, when he talks about it, he basically says they kind of lucked into it. They picked something that they thought was really cool, that they were really passionate about. And it turns out that this thing they're building, Retool, which is kind of like these internal programming tools for companies, has a huge TAM, a huge market where there's just tons of customers who'll pay a ton of money for this. And it turns out to be a really good business. But like he didn't sit down and like plan all of that out. He didn't like draw up a business model and figure it out. He just kind of lucked into it. And there's so many other founders who are probably equally as talented, equally as smart, who read as many books, who work just as hard. But that luck component is like, they didn't really also put that much money or time into thinking about their idea. And so they just have a smaller TAM, and their passion just doesn't happen to be correlated with something that can turn into a really big business. And so I think a lot of what you want to do as a founder is obviously try to erase as much luck as possible and replace that with skill. And what's cool about you as an investor is, I talk to a lot of founders who like choose an idea and don't consider TAM. But as an investor, that's probably like one of the very first things you look at. You probably have a whole checklist of like, can this business work? Is it going to be the right size? Can it grow fast enough? What's a competitive market, competitive landscape look like? That a lot of founders just like aren't really asking. So, walk us through some of the things that you look at in any particular company, and that you think maybe more founders should look at, so they can kind of look at their companies through the same lens an investor might look through.
That's interesting. I don't spend a lot of time looking at TAM because we don't need billion. Like if you're going to build a billion or a $10 billion company, you absolutely have to say this is a massive, massive market. Because if it's not worth it. But if I'm going to say, well, let's build a 5, 10, $20 million company, I need to do a little check and be like, do I think there's that many people that are willing to pay this purchase, this price to get there? And that's about it. I mean, there's not a ton because there are just so many more opportunities. And that is really the beauty of this, right? Is it's the, it's that we can literally have thousands and thousands of companies that can get to 10 or 20 million. And yeah. So the way that I think about it, I mean, so yes, we do have a long evaluation criteria, a bunch of questions, how much traction do they have? What is the team like? What is their experience? Why are they the right people? Blah, blah, blah. But the way it's kind of boring. So I'll put it into the, this is the fortune cookie version that I think of. It's 3 Ps. It's people, product market fit, and price sensitivity. So the people are the founders. Do I feel like they love what they're doing? Do I feel like they, have the ambition? Do I feel like they're shipping? Are they smart founders? I mean, there's effectiveness. There's all kinds of things. Product market fit is obviously, have they built something that people want and are willing to pay for? Because building something people want is amazing, but sometimes you can do that and then people aren't willing to pay for it. So hitting product market fit, and then that step after, which I've been calling escape velocity, which is where you're actually, because product market fit is where, all right, we built something people want. You still need to find marketing channels and sales channels that work. And once you start to do that, even if you find one, that's when revenue really kicks, So that's product market fit. And then price sensitivity, I could just say pricing, but it's like, per our earlier conversation or earlier question, price is such a massive lever that if you can only charge $14 for this product, and you'll probably only ever be able to charge $14 for this product, or if your average revenue per user is $14, and I talk to a founder and I say, hey, how are you thinking about expanding that? And the founder's like, have never thought about that. And that's a bit of a yellow flag, not a red flag, obviously, but like you should be thinking about that. That's a really important thing. And so again, low ARPU is not bad if there's an angle, if there's a way to either raise that over time or to bring in like enterprise customers, because that's the real way you're going to get into the 7 and 8 figure companies.
So I know at TinySeed, people applying to join the batches are a little bit more mature. They're not necessarily in the I don't have an idea phase, but a ton of indie hackers are in the I don't have an idea phase. And if there's kind of like this checklist of things that they should be aiming for, ideally high average revenue per user, like ideally something that can have good expansion revenue. Obviously, they need to find product market fit. Is there anything that an indie hacker can do in that situation to try to come up with an idea that does meet some of these criteria? And the reason I ask is because it's hard enough for people just to come up with an idea that makes any sense at all. People are sitting around just like, I have no idea what to build. None of the problems that I have seem like they would be good businesses to solve. And it's even harder to build, not only come up with an idea from scratch, but come up with an idea that checks off all these boxes. How would you approach doing something like that?
This is a first-time founder?
Yeah, first-time founder. Or maybe even someone who's been around, like, because I talked to a lot of people who've basically been starting things and failing and flailing. And maybe they've started a few businesses in the past, but they're just not sure how to come up with an idea that like actually has some promise out of the gate.
Yeah. That's because coming up with ideas is not only really hard, but I just question it as an exercise altogether. Ideas often becomes a solution without a problem. So I've started from the problem every time, at least when I've done it well. When I've done it poorly, I start with my own ideas. Yeah. Oh man, there's this new technology, right? I was a software developer for years. New technology. How can I turn that into a product? That's not the way to go about it. So there's 2 things I would say is, especially for first time, like again, coming back to stair stepping, it's like, how can I find a really small product to build just to learn copywriting and marketing and customer support and get the experience and the skill and the confidence and build my tool belt out. I would tend to lean towards these ecosystems, almost these app stores, because the marketing isn't as hard. The distribution is built in. So Shopify App Store, Photoshop add-ons. There's a bunch of others. And of course, I wouldn't personally go into mobile apps because they're so crowded. But any of these ecosystems, there's like Salesforce add-ons, any of these ecosystem where, and there are a bunch of them now because a bunch of companies have built platforms. And the beauty is if you can get in there and you can rank for something, the distribution's built in, and you won't have learned all the chops of marketing, but you will at least now have a resource, meaning you'll have money coming in, and you'll have learned these other skills and built confidence in yourself. But even from there, okay, Rob, so you're saying go build a Shopify app, right? Which may or may not be a great idea. Well, there's already a bunch of Shopify apps. So how do I come up with an idea there? That's where I go. I try to find, where are there disgruntled people? Where are there people complaining about something? Because people who have pain complain. And wow, that rhymed. I literally just came up with that. I'm saying that. People who have pain complain. And so that may be forums, that may be private Slack groups, that may be Facebook groups, that may be the, I don't know where. There's places you can go to find this out. Maybe it's in-person conversations where you hear someone complaining. I would love, wouldn't it be amazing if you were going to try to build a Shopify app, if you could go to LinkedIn, find an ex-Shopify email support rep or customer support rep, ping them and say, hey, I'd love to have a conversation with you. I can pay you money for it, and just have a conversation. Like, what were some of the biggest things that people complained about that Shopify didn't do? Or what were the plugins that were super popular but didn't do stuff? And just try to get inside, especially if they're not there anymore, because otherwise it'd be inside information. That's just something I came up at the top off the top of my head, but it's being creative about not looking at the same data everyone else is and trying to find pain points and sources that you can suddenly, kind of whittle your way in. Because even in competitive spaces, like, we launched an ESP in 2013, for crying out loud. There were literally hundreds of others. And yet we figured out that there was pain with some of the ESPs, and how, people wanted more from it. And that was the problem that we solved.
I love this approach because it all flows from what you said earlier, which is like problem first. Don't think of a solution, but think of a problem. And if you really bought into that, which is really, it's one of those fundamentals, like get enough sleep, get enough exercise, don't start with the solution, start with the problem. A lot of people pay lip service to, but don't actually do. But once you're actually doing it, it looks like what you're saying. Actually talk to people, ask for pain points before you have any sort of idea for what it is that you're going to build. You should be doing this hunting. And I also like the idea of building on kind of a marketplace. Probably the vast majority of indie hackers who are first getting started know zero about sales or marketing or distribution. And if you can just like make that part easier for yourself, which is what you're advising, then you're not going to learn everything there is to learn your first time at bat. But you're much more likely to succeed because you can focus on all the other hard parts. How do you build a product? How do you do customer support? How do you come up with a good solution for a problem? And then next time around, maybe you could make the distribution challenge a little bit harder, maybe not build on a marketplace, and sort of stair step your way to building on the advantages and the things you learned earlier, rather than making it super hard for yourself out of the gate and having to learn everything.
Yeah, I think of it like a tool belt, like maybe Batman's utility belt, where when you start, you literally may only have one thing there, and it's what you do for a living, right? So if you're a developer, you have code, and if you're a designer, then you have design chops, or if you're in sales and you have sales chops. How do you start building that out to get, SEO, PPC, other types of marketing, copywriting, customer support, and then you just build those out one at a time. I would not have been able to start Drip 15 years ago when I really started kicking up my entrepreneurial career. Frankly, 20 years ago is when I launched the first apps, but the first 5 years was exactly what you're talking about. It was me coming up with ideas, spending much time building them, and all of them failed. But then slowly it's like, oh, you learn one, and then two, and then three, and then four. You don't have to learn them all at once. I couldn't have learned them all at once, and I wouldn't have had success with Drip 15 years ago because I didn't have that utility belt, and I didn't have the confidence I could do it either.
Well, listen, Rob, you've learned a ton. And it's cool to see some of the insights that you've had by working with such a wide array of companies instead of just starting your own companies one at a time. Is there any parting advice that you would like to leave these fledgling indie hackers with, especially with the times we're going through right now? A lot of people are surprisingly starting more companies than ever. What I've noticed is people aren't as worried about being out of work as you might think. A lot of them are just starting companies and not looking for jobs. What's your advice to people in that situation?
Yeah, I think we're in the best time in history for indie hackers and software founders. 30 years ago, this was, it was shareware. It was just such a different game. So relish the fact that we live in this time in history and have the skills as likely, developers or designers to do this. Where, the rest of my family worked construction, worked or works in construction their whole life. And that's fine. Hey, I did it for several years, but they don't have the skills that we do. They haven't developed them to get out of it, to to have this freedom that we're all seeking. And the second thing I'd say is, there's this great quote from I believe it's Thomas Jefferson, and it's, the harder I work, the luckier I get. Put in the work. Like it's and again, I'm not saying long hours, but I'm saying focus and put in the work and build that tool belt, and hopefully you build your own luck.
Rob Walling, thanks for coming on the show. Can you let listeners know where to go to find out more about what you're up to with TinySeed and MicroConf and your various podcasts that you have going on now?
I'll only plug one podcast. I have 3 different ones. But yeah, so if you like podcasts and you're not listening to startups for the rest of us, we're about to hit our 500th episode. And I've been really up in the game over the past 6 or 8 months. So I do some interviews, but we do a lot of Q&A, and it's all about this stuff. I mean, this is where all these frameworks come, is from just talking about this all the time. And then, of course, tinyseed.com, if you're interested, even just we're going to open applications in the fall. So if you're, just want to get on the mailing list, you can head there. Also, if you're interested in investing in early stage B2B SaaS companies, we are doing an open raise in essence. So tinyseed.com/invest, if that is something on your radar. And then, microconf.com, I guess, is the last one. And that's our community for essentially self-funded and independently funded startups around the world.
All right. Thanks so much, Rob.
Thanks for having me, man.